Even people who don't really know much about the Bible can probably give you a high-level synopsis of the parable of the prodigal son. They can probably recall it's about a son who requests his inheritance early, recklessly spends it all, and crawls back home, broke and desperate. But instead of facing the rejection he expected and perhaps deserved, the son was warmly embraced by his father, who threw a huge party to celebrate his return. And they may even be able to tell you that the story is about forgiveness and is meant to show how God is enthusiastically waiting to welcome his lost children back home. And if this is how you remember the story, you're not wrong. But this is just part of the point that Jesus was making. And you may be surprised to learn that this story we deem as uplifting was actually a confronting warning to some in Jesus' audience. And that this simple story encapsulates so much of what Jesus' earthly ministry was all about. So let's dive in and take a deeper look at the parable of the prodigal son. We pick up in Luke chapter 15. Jesus' preaching attracted a crowd of tax collectors and people described as sinners. The scribes and Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day, were also present in the audience. As it's noted, they grumbled about Jesus' preaching to those of low moral standing. It's in this setting that Jesus proceeds to tell a series of 3 parables. The first 2 parables, the parable of the lost sheep and the parable of the lost coin, were both about someone losing something of importance and rejoicing when they found it, providing an illustration of the great joy in heaven when a lost sinner turns back to God and repents. Now, the parable of the prodigal son was told next, and while it was similar to the first 2 parables, it was far longer and more complex, making it clear it was about more than just rejoicing when something lost is found. The story goes like this. There was not 1, but 2 sons, and we're told that the younger of the sons approached his father and asked for his inheritance, an act that would have been seen as deeply offensive, as it was in essence the son telling his father he didn't want him, he wanted his stuff. The father nevertheless obliged. He gave his son his share, and the son takes off. And it was not long before the son quickly squanders it all and finds himself hungry and broke in a land experiencing a famine. And out of desperation, the prodigal son took a degrading job, feeding pigs, an animal seen as unclean by the Jewish people, and he found himself longing for the food he was feeding them. So he decided to return home and beg his father for forgiveness in hope that his father would let him work as one of his servants. But as the son approached home, the father saw him from a long distance. He ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him before the son could even get a word in. Eventually, the son says, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father simply turns to his servants and exclaims, "Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And a large celebratory feast began, presumably with the whole village, as the fattened calf was slain for the occasion. Now, while all this was happening, the older brother was out working in the field, and as he drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. He asked one of the servants what was going on, and the servant informed him of his younger brother's return and the celebration his father was throwing. At this, he was furious and refused to come into the party. His father came outside to try to convince him to join, but he furiously declined, stating, "Look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command. Yet you never even gave me a young goat that I may celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him?" The father continued to plead with his older son, saying, "Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found." And with that, the story ends, leaving people to wonder, what happened? Did the older brother go in? Was there reconciliation? We don't know. The story ends with no resolution. But there's a point to it. Recall at the beginning of Luke chapter 15 that Jesus was speaking to multiple categories of people: tax collectors and sinners, and scribes and Pharisees. Now, the tax collectors specifically were seen by the local Jews as greedy, degenerate traitors. They abandoned their people by taking a job with the Romans, building great wealth for the occupying enemy and for themselves, while gouging their own people for money. They had chosen wealth over their own families and their principles. Sound like anyone in the story? The younger son in this story represents these tax collectors and other sinners in the audience. And in a larger sense, he represents all sinners and those in rebellion against God. The Israelite people, you and I, all of whom are guilty of wanting God's stuff but not desiring God because we want to do things our own way and not God's way. Much of Jesus' ministry was focused on these sort of people. Jesus was frequently found among the poor and those outcast as sinners because, as he puts it, it's not the healthy who need a doctor but the sick, and that he had not come to call the righteous but sinners. Yet Jesus was repeatedly called out for communing with these people by the scribes and Pharisees, the Jewish leaders of the time who saw themselves as the morally pure upholders of the law who would not become defiled or ceremonially unclean by associating themselves with such degenerates. And it's these scribes and Pharisees that made up the other group that Jesus was speaking to. This group was represented in the story by the older son. The older son seemed to be doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. He was out in the field working. He had not squandered his father's money. He had not run off and partied it up with women and booze. He was right where he was supposed to be, working his father's land. Yet he was very quick, suspiciously quick, you might say, to bring up this fact and to point out how morally justified and superior he was to his prodigal brother as soon as his father did something he didn't like. It's almost as though he had been doing what he was supposed to be doing simply to prop himself up and make himself look good, so he could use it as leverage against his father when things didn't go his way. But while the older son looked good on the outside, in his frustration he revealed his true heart. Not one that was happy to know his brother was alive or full of joy for his father, rather a heart that reveled in being seen as superior to his loser brother and longed for his share of the inheritance he felt was due to him. This made the older brother fit Jesus' description of the Pharisees in that he appeared to people as righteous, but on the inside was full of hypocrisy and wickedness. The Pharisees, in similarity to the older brother, were rigid sticklers for the law. In fact, they competed with one another in a twisted game of who could follow it best, down to its most minute and inconsequential details, even adding on rules they made up. And they felt that this strict adherence gave them superior standing in society and in the eyes of God, when in reality, it created artificial barriers to God. And they were so boastful of their adherence to God's law that they failed to see that the law had become the focus instead of God. On the surface, they did what they were supposed to be doing, but they were doing it for the wrong reasons. Jesus pushed back against the scribes and Pharisees, accusing them of neglecting the weightier matters of the law like justice, forgiveness, and faithfulness in favor of their own legalist, moralist traditions. And he demonstrated this principle by audaciously violating their rigid interpretation of the law by doing things like violating the Sabbath by working, aka healing the man on the Sabbath. He called out the Pharisees for their hypocrisy and reinforced throughout his ministry that the underpinnings of the law were to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, and to love your neighbors as yourself. Jesus' teaching at the Sermon on the Mount further emphasized that it's not about adherence to the law, but it's about pureness of heart. After all, the purpose of the law was to condemn. It was never meant to be a means of justification. It was meant to show that without God's grace and forgiveness, man would always fall short. So in this story, we have two broken people, a younger son who is rebellious and hedonistic, who blatantly does things his own way, and an older son who is legalistic and trying to earn his own righteousness. The older son, like the younger son, was still using his father and was still after his father's things. He just went about obtaining them in a different way, through a path of obedience. Both sons were guilty of not wanting a relationship with their father, trying to get their father's things, and being all about themselves. And both are representative of two common classifications of people who are not saved. Either they are rebellious, openly rejecting God and his plans for them, or they are ignorant of their need for God and think that they can achieve righteousness on their own. They think that because they are a good person, or because they do this or that they will be saved, and that they don't need God's offer of grace and forgiveness. Yet we see God making the same offer of grace to both types of people. If you haven't figured it out by now, the father in this story represents God, and he's making the offer of reconciliation to both sons. God reaches out to the legalist and the hedonist, to the proud and the broken. But what we often see is that while God's offer is the same to both, it's often harder for older sons to answer the call. Those who are trying to achieve their own righteousness, the boastful and the proud, are unable to see their need and accept the grace that has been offered to them. This is why Jesus noted, "Blessed are the meek and poor in spirit," and warned of how hard it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. The poor are blessed because their condition produces reliance on God, while the rich, like the proud, feel that they are self-sufficient and don't see their need for him. While telling this story, God in the flesh was reaching out to the Pharisees, who would have realized he was talking about them in this story. And he's telling them to look inward and warning them of the implications if they refuse. The dinner party, the celebration at the end of the story, is representative of God's kingdom or heaven. And God is pleading for all to come in and join him. The question is, will they? The younger son did. He realized the folly of his ways, repented, and was welcomed into the party. Will the older son? We don't know. But we do know that most of the scribes and Pharisees did not accept the invitation. They crucified Jesus. Despite their outward appearances, They were so lost, blinded by their own pride and arrogance, that they could not see God even when He was standing right in front of them. For those in Christ, the parable of the prodigal son is a reminder of the grace God has shown to you. You were dead, and now you are alive. You were lost, and now you are found. But for those who have not accepted Christ, it requires that you make a choice. The celebration has started. Will you enter? Prodigal is a mission to get people to return, whether they are older sons, younger sons, or something in between. Learn more about us and consider supporting our ministry at prodigal.org.